It's my great pleasure to have today as our guest for the podcast, The Meaning of Life, where philosophy becomes personal, Shay Welch. Shay is an associate professor of philosophy at Spelman College. Recently, she was the 2021 Carnegie Corporation and Rockefeller Foundation Distinguished Researcher Creative Scholar. She is the chair of the Association for Feminist Ethics and Social Theory, a founding board member of Tenure for the Common Good, and was a founding contributor to the Howard University Social Justice Consortium. Previously, she was the Gaius Charles Bolin Fellow in the university in philosophy at Williams College. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Binghamton University. Her current book is Choreography as Embodied Critical Inquiry, Embodied Cognition and Creative Movement, Palgrave Macmillan. A recent book is The Phenomenology of a Performative Knowledge System, Dancing with Native American Epistemology, always with the Palgrave Macmillan 2019. Her previous books are Existential Eroticism, A Feminist Ethics Approach to Women's Oppression, Perpetuating Choices, Lexington Books 2015, and A Theory of Freedom, Feminism and Social Contract, Palgrave Macmillan again. She teaches courses on freedom, embodied knowledge, embodied cognition, dance, systemic oppression, ethics, sex, feminism, and Native American philosophy. Her professional goals are to support and mentor young women of color in philosophy and to aid the discipline in recruiting and retaining more unrepresented young philosophers. She's especially interested in resisting practices of classism and fighting against stigma related to mental health disorders. Well, with a profile like this, I can't be just excited to have such a productive and feisty
That
philosopher.
sounded really dramatic and like over the top. I just kept thinking, I need to cut that down. That's a lot.
No, I think the books you wrote, the areas you researched on, it's so interesting. Please, let's start talking here. I saw, you worked a lot against stigma. And you feel very much for unrepresented voices. How did you manage to get a voice of your own in which, you felt heard?
Well, whether or not a person or a scholar ever feels heard is an entirely different question than how one gets a voice. I think if you would ask anybody else, they would say that I was born with a big voice. So I've just kind of gone around the world screaming my thoughts at people, regardless of whether or not they were paying attention. So, it's very easy, both as a person and a scholar, to not feel heard. As a person, it's always very hard to feel like you connect to other people, just generally speaking. And that can make you not feel heard. As a scholar, there's so much research out there that you always wonder if anybody's reading you. Mm-hmm. And, everybody thinks that they have something really important to say, or else they wouldn't be writing it. And so, you always really, really want people to listen, like to read you. But everybody's stack of things that need to be read is so long that you can't even beg your friends to do it. They'll get around to it if they can. So there, I always tell people to just say what they gotta say, mm-hmm. regardless, because it's at the very least cathartic.
Yeah, I saw in your short bio, you said that where you came from, you felt often looked down upon. That for you, philosophy was a way to be able to talk, to be able to be seen. Where did you come from? I mean, I had the feeling that was not so much as a geographical space, but the social context was somewhat relevant for you to get where you are today.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I try to resist practices of classism and stigma within the profession is because of where I come from, and also because in my experience, not a lot of people come from the same kind of background that I do. I came from a very poor family, there was a lot of violence and addiction and jail and just general discord internally and externally. So there was always growing up a constant sense of survival mode, I guess, not just for me, but for everyone in my family. You know, the idea of just trying to survive the world and each other was always a thing. And I know that because of like the culture and class position, I just watched a lot of my family members be disrespected constantly by people outside and judged and just treated with general disrespect and disdain. And I feel that a lot of people who come from these kinds of backgrounds get sucked in. And that was always a possibility for me. I had to leave home and early, like in high school, and I had to leave the state, and I had to leave my family, and I had to cut contact, and I had to do a lot of things that weren't easy because I saw myself just being pulled into the same whirlpool. You know, it was like either it was get in or get out. And I kind of chose to get out. And then I just kind of wandered the world for a little bit until I found philosophy.
Philosophy in this, because I mean, when you are on a survival mode, it's very difficult to think, right? To enjoy, to lose yourself in a reading, and studying is a luxury. How did you meet philosophy?
Ooh, I think I've told this story before. It's one of my favorite stories. I always tell my students this story when they're crying and complaining about how hard it is. I failed my first philosophy class. In a more, you know, given the standard social environment of college, I kind of am the only fully literate person in my family. Like, not to say that people in my family can't read, but you know, they're in terms of having like a broader ability to engage materials. But for this reason, right, so school wasn't a big thing where I come from. I didn't know how to study, but I also didn't care. Like I just kind of wandered through the world, and then I ended up taking an ethics class because I had to. And I had this guy, bless his heart, he was just the worst teacher. Like, even when I reflect back on it today, he was great, he was fantastic, but he was possibly one of the worst teachers I've ever had. He could not stay on track, and instead of going, like, I think the ethics class was Kant. Like, that was my first exposure to philosophy, was the the critique of pure reason. And he loved to just sit around and do the German and Greek translations of things. So I just slept every day. Like, I had no idea what was going on. I swore that I would never take philosophy again. And I didn't until I was graduating. God only knows how that happened. I was graduating, and like I think it was my last semester, I still had to fill my humanities requirement, and there was an ethics class it was the only one available, and it was a different teacher. So I was like, okay. And I took it, and it was more like contemporary ethics. And the teacher, while not a pleasant fellow, was on track. And I felt alive. Like, I didn't care about him. I didn't care about the other students. I didn't care about anything. I just knew that I was reading this stuff, and it was like, this is the stuff that matters. Like, all of the other things that I did, like English class and history class and sociology and my political science degree and all of these other things, like, I didn't care about any of them. And then I read the stuff, and I was like, ooh, this stuff matters. And I also have a reply. Like, I want to talk too. And I aced the class. It was like the breeziest thing I've ever done. And I decided to stick around an extra year and get a second degree in philosophy. And I plowed through. It was like 21 hours a semester, and I made straight A's the whole year. It was the most amazing thing that I've ever experienced. I was so deeply happy. Yeah, it was great.
A question that stood out more than others, or a philosopher, where did you feel the hook?
I think that it was just cool that I was reading things that asked me questions, and I had something to say. Like, you know, when you do comparative politics, like when you do any other discipline, and I know this, I don't mean it to sound this way, but I've never read anything else in any other discipline and been like, now I have a question. You know what I mean? It just seemed like, okay, I just read something on the Bay of Pigs, and there it is. I don't know what you want me to say. Like, that's it. And so I just had the best time. Like, I just remember reading everything voraciously. And I did have trouble with Descartes. Like, when we did some modern stuff, I had to teach myself how to read because we like to use long sentences. And I remember spending weeks trying to teach myself how to get through a sentence.
I know.
You know, and instead of me thinking this is stupid, I was like, the challenge is real. I must get to the next sentence. It was just a different thing. So I remember one class that so I took Indian philosophy, and that's how I originally got into like Indian epistemology and metaphysics, like Hindu. And I remember reading a lot of Nagarjuna, which is Buddhist. And all Nagarjuna did was negative critiques of all the other theories. And I just was so annoyed because I was like, okay, it's so easy to sit back in your chair and to critique everybody else, but what do you have to say? And he like never said anything. And I would get so frustrated in class that I like made a little note, like I took a piece of paper and I wrote, "That's trash" on it. So that every time they were talking about it, I would just raise my little sign and say, "That's trash." Because I got tired of being like, what is the point?
Right.
But even when I was like, what's the point? I was thinking, what would I say? Like, how could he do better? And I remember, as frustrating as it was, like, that was a great class. And I really loved learning about specifically Hindu philosophy.
And you continued, I mean, you explored the different areas in your books. You worked on Native American philosophy, eroticism, choreography. will you tell us a little about the voice that you found in philosophy and how you expressed it and your passion behind it? Because they are all themes that have also a strong political and social relevance, I think.
Yeah, it's anyone who doesn't know me would think that I can't stay on track. People would, I think that if you put my books out next to each other in a line and just showed it to strangers, they would never attribute it to the same author.
I understand, yeah.
But people who know me, like, they know that that's like they can look at that series of books and be like, obviously all of those belong to Shay. So they're all related to my identity and all related to things that I've done. So the first book is about the failure of social contract theory to account for the role of social oppression. And that's one of the causes of injustices that feminists are concerned about. And so this came a lot from my background, thinking about marginalized people, generally speaking, and just like the notion of respect and vulnerability became very big. Trust, right? Social trust became very important when I think about like what do I think people need in order to have justice as an equal social member. Those, you know, I tried to paint that picture of what I thought it was. And then for existential eroticism,
sorry.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the social contract we're referring to? Because that is an interesting piece of the reasoning. Because in the social contract, the women are completely not there. Yeah, just to give the reader, the listener, a little bit the context.
Right. So, dead white guy social contract theory talks about the origins of our democratic society.
Yes.
And gives an idea of what they think society was like before government. And everybody but Rousseau thought that we were crazy in one way or another, at least problematic. Rousseau was always very cool. He just thought that everybody was like getting high or something in a tree. That's the way I always think about it. When I think about Rousseau's State of Nature, I was like, he just thinks people are in tree houses getting high. I don't know. But, you know, so then the idea is supposed to be what people are like in the state of nature, gives reasons for why we need to have the governments that we need to have. And so if you're like Hobbes and you think people are vicious, then you have to have a totalitarian state. You know, if you think like Locke, people are kind of greedy, but, you know, they should have their own stuff for this reason, then you're going to have more of like what the United States looks like today, very private property capitalism. Rousseau is always the debate. I'm a Rousseauian. Which is hilarious because Rousseau has the worst picture of women.
The worst.
And it's so bad that I love it, because the thing is like, he's right. Like, that is, especially from like a sex worker position, like that's exactly how women are taught to be. And I was like, Rousseau says we should do it, but he's not wrong that we're taught to do that, right? And I was like, well, if anyone's giving a realistic picture of what women's training looks like, it's Rousseau. And I really like Rousseau because I think it's very collective in terms of community participation for political purposes. You know, it depends on what position you have, because some people think that he's the true totalitarian.
Yep.
It just depends on how you read him, I guess. I think because he considered oppression and the role of oppression in his State of Nature, I give him the collective interpretation, because I think that if he was more concerned with domination, then he wouldn't have been so concerned with oppression. So feminists came in and they were like, why are you doing these things to women? Because they did all these things to women, like, traded them and used them for birthing and property and all these great things. Rousseau used them for dolls and entertainment. And they just talked about all of the ways that women have been excluded from the social contract, and that is the reason why we have patriarchal sexism today. And then given these things, these are kind of the feminist responses we need to have to it. But they're very framed within the political system and dealing within sort of the Rawlsian like notion of justice in the public sphere and like the legal system and public government and all of those things. But like the true Rousseauian I just kept thinking the problem is interpersonal oppression. Mm-hmm. It's like we wouldn't have all of these problems in the institution if they weren't existing interpersonally. And I also think that if everybody was so upset by the problems of the institutions, they would just stop acting on them, but somehow they haven't, which gives a good sign that people are pretty comfortable with the status quo. And so my approach to the social contract was to show how the political conception of a social contract was kind of useless. And to show that if we want to talk about how social contract theory can give us true justice, we need to actually talk about a social contract, which is ethical in nature.
Yeah. And still we are with big corporations that, if possible, made institutions even heavier and less personal than before. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that there's about 5 investment companies that now own Atlanta because of gentrification. So like when I moved here, everything was all like local, underground, mom and pop stores. Everything was independent. And everything right now, everything is bought out by the same investment companies. And you just keep watching all these local shops close and close and close and close for the paint and sip shops. So I feel like it's gotten worse because of the accumulation of wealth.
Yeah, and the repetition of the same, then the person disappears and everything is the same.
Right.
Anyway, so thank you so much for these parentheses, because it was quite rich, the way in which the social contract excluded women from the origin. And
I should be clear that it excludes non-Western racialized people as well. There's plenty of stuff that talks about that. I'm just focusing on women because there was, I was taking like a strain of feminist philosophers to enter into the conversation.
Right, yeah. The social contract, excludes many categories, in fact. And the second book instead, what did animate you to set out and write that book?
Well, I come from a family of sex work and addiction and domestic violence. And I feel like even in the best intentioned feminist philosophy, they talk about these kinds of women. And I don't think they always do a good job. And then they give sort of ethical evaluations of these women or their choices. And I definitely don't think they do a good job. And I really liked rational choice theory philosophy. And what always surprised me about rational choice theory, and even in feminist ethics, was that everyone that I was related to would have been considered irrational and like a bad chooser and a bad actor. And what that turned out to be like, and they would be like, and that's lucky because then they're not morally responsible for anything. And I just kept thinking, like, this is bullshit. This is not what it's like to survive in these kinds of unfortunate circumstances. And to point out, like, I realize, like, you know, domestic violence and addiction and all of these things are everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's just that, you know, I was writing from my perspective, one where it was all kind of piled on top of each other, a lot to do with like poverty. And I would always argue with even feminist philosophers about why these analyses of rational choice weren't right. And they would be like, I don't know why you're arguing. Like, yeah, the choices are, you know, that your family members made, like the women in your family made, were irrational, but that means they're not responsible for them. And I'm like, bullshit, they're not responsible. Like, they worked really hard to make these kinds of choices to help them survive their circumstances. And if you told them that they weren't responsible for where it got them, which is usually at least better off than it was, they'd be really pissed.
Of course.
Right. And so I just kind of made a new rational choice theory.
Oh, beautiful.
That talked about what it was like for women, whether it's lower class women or racialized women or immigrant women or like all of those kinds of women, what it's like to have to make these kinds of choices, and what it's like to fight these kinds of conditions. Like, my aunt was killed by domestic violence. My sister was almost killed by domestic violence. Oh, every woman in my family besides me has experienced domestic violence pretty extensively. They've all done sex work. I've done sex work. I could call it sex work light. But all of us have been in and out of strip clubs and doing these kinds of things. And I really wanted to talk about what it's like to be one of those women, mm-hmm. instead of hearing other people talk about those kinds of women. And also to talk about, but a lot of my concern was always that the choices that we make it harder for other women. Like, they're like, you know, like if you're doing sex work, you know, it just makes it harder for women in sex work. It makes it harder for women to avoid sex work. You know, if women who have to stay in domestic violent relationships in order to prevent more violence or protect their children or protect their dogs, you know, like it makes it harder for other women to leave violent situations. So there are tough choices that women make that make it harder for other women, or even like women who are hustling the system through really glamorous kinds of sex work because they fit a certain aesthetic and they make all this money, right? And then it kind of glamorizes it, and it teaches younger girls like, this is a good way, right? And depending on who you are, sometimes that's a good way. But in the larger sphere of things, like, women can get sucked into that kind of lifestyle, thinking it's going to be a good way, and then not always enjoying it.
Right.
So I made a new theory of rational choice theory that talked about that and also how it relates to oppressing other women.
And what kind of definition of rationality did you come up with in the end?
I came up with something called desperate rationality,
mm-hmm.
and it is a form of hyper rationality, which means that whilst the person, you know, I call it the privilege of safety, right? While there are these people who are safe in the world, you know, generally speaking, are out there making reasonable and rational decisions. Like, they don't have to work that hard to be reasonable and rational, right? It's not that complicated. Generally, I look around and it's just not that complicated. but the people who are surviving or navigating these kinds of situations, they have to really be rational. And sometimes that's not even the reasonable choice. Like they even know, like, that's not reasonable, but this is my most rational decision. And I talk about desperation as an all-encompassing state of affairs. So like sometimes you're desperate, and sometimes an action is desperate, and sometimes a situation is desperate, but sometimes for some people you exist in a world of desperation. Mm-hmm. Everything is desperate. And when you get into those kinds of fighting and surviving context where every choice that you make determines whether or not you make it to another day, it's like weightlifting for your rationality. Mm-hmm. Like the kinds of rational choices that these kinds of people make every single day to make it just another day is exercising more rationality than any person you see generally on the street. And like the people on the street think that it's irrational because they just can't conceive of what it must be like to be in those situations.
Right.
So I did a little oppression-based game theory and used that to reconceive of a rational choice theory that talked about the highly sophisticated rationality of the choice and the individual moral responsibility that goes with that, because that's good, right? But then also is able to, because of this state of affairs that's desperate, it can disconnect the desperately acting women from having moral responsibility for making women's life harder. Right. So while it's the case that you have individual moral responsibility for your hyper-rational choice, given the desperation, you are not necessarily fully morally responsible for perpetuating women's oppression.
Right. Because you need to survive within your system. I mean, you cannot go that far. It's within your setting. And is there space for happiness somewhere in this kind of rationality, or happiness is some luxury?
I think that everybody has happiness.
What do you think? Yeah, tell me more.
I mean, I've seen women and men. I've seen people at a get together laugh and laugh and laugh. And even if there's an immediate violent interaction, you can turn right around and start laughing again. And so it's this idea of like all-encompassing happiness doesn't make sense to me. Mm. Like, what does it mean to be happy? And it's like, well, life is hard. Little things are happy. Like little things can make you happy. Like a good candy makes me happy, like genuinely, deeply happy. And then 20 minutes later, I can get stressed out about something and I'm not happy anymore. And some people may be like, oh, well, that's your like mood, not your state. And I'm like, well, state is, I don't know. I don't even know what it means to have a state. Like I'm never in like I wouldn't describe anything about my life as the state of Shay. I think happiness is fleeting because happiness is frequent. And things that make you happy come and go, and things that make you happy change, right? And sometimes you just can't, you're too busy to be happy. Yeah.
You need that rationality, responsibility are components to, like a ladder, to get to these fleeting moments, or they just happen, that even if you are.
Yeah, I mean, they do just happen. I mean, sometimes you're just at the Walgreens and somebody's really nice to you.
Yeah.
You could be having a really bad day and they can just make you happy. And then like the outlook can totally change. I always look for those little things, and I try to, when I find the little moments of happiness, I try to like grab onto them, and I'm like, oh, this is nice, right?
Ask you, this is a very personal question. You decide, of course. But did your mom or your sister, anyone in your family, ever manage to understand what you're doing? Because I mean, the gap here is huge, right? And
I don't have contact with my family.
I see, I see.
So when I left, I left.
Uh-huh. So it's a long distance letter. Your philosophy somehow. You're putting
I
all
don't
the.
know if they really know what I do.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I don't know if they know where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
I know that for a lot of my life, they had no idea where I was. I think because I've been in Atlanta longer than I've been anywhere else. I think if you said, where is she? They might get in the vicinity. And then if you said, what does she do? They might say that I'm a teacher.
Okay. Close enough.
Close enough. Close enough. So.
Because, yeah, I mean, you are putting out in the world ideas that are going to influence this system. I mean, hopefully we'll be able to see domestic. I really like how you put the problem of rationality, actually. I work as a philosophical counselor, and sometimes I feel really bad, and my family too was a mess. I feel really bad for those people who might not have a word to explain what they are feeling. But my God, if they are more rational than all the others that are there with your toolbox, capable of explaining this and that and how to arrive this. So I think that revising a theory of rationality, giving another sense to rationality, making rationality less bullying, less, from the top down, helps people in general to believe in themselves in moments in which, okay, I have lost control. I'm spiraling. I don't know what I'm doing. No, you know what you're doing, because you're doing it, and somehow you're saving yourself day after day.
Yeah, because there's moments, because I really hate when people say things like, you always have a choice. That's not true. Like, there are lots of times when people don't have a choice, and I think the rationality in that, when you're in a situation where you don't have a choice, there are dynamics going on in that situation, and all these little mechanisms about how you behave, like even in that little moment, can determine whether or not that's better or worse for you. Like the outcome is better or worse for you. And so while you don't have a choice to do X, the way in which you go about doing X without dire consequences requires a lot of rationality.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not like, oh, I don't have a choice. It's just, like, I guess I don't have to like reason about anything. Like when you don't have a choice, that's when you're in hyper gear reasoning mode. Right. And I think that gets lost a lot. And people just want to be like, oh, victims. And there are victims, right? But that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of victims don't want to be called victims, is because they're like, let's see you survive as long as I have. Right.
Absolutely. And it takes away from you every agency and subjectivity you have in your life.
Yeah.
Call that way. Yeah. It lowers the effort to understand what's going on in your life.
I mean, if you just like stop reasoning in choices or in contexts where you didn't have any choices, you wouldn't be so stressed out all the time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Look, and choreography, how does it come in the picture? Because I mean, speaking of agency, being there, knowing your choices, is there any connection? How did you land to choreography?
I am a circus artist.
Oh, wow. Oh my God, that's wonderful.
I mean, I've been out of the game for a little while because I like super tore my shoulder and I keep trying to rehabilitate it. But I was a choreographer for circus stuff.
That's very hard. I mean,
It's very hard. Yes, that's how I tore my shoulder. Yeah, it's a little dangerous.
Yeah. And tell me more.
I mean, if you were to say what is the one thing that okay, so there are two things in the world that make me truly happy.
Uh-huh.
Writing my philosophy. Right? Not all the background stuff like, oh, and then Rawls says, and then so and so. Like, I really hate that part. That's like the worst. But like when I get to my stuff, I'm like, ooh, listen to me go. Like, I'm brilliant. So I really like that, makes me happy. And then Ariel makes me happy, which is I've been struggling a lot being out of the game, like a lot, because that was just one thing that no matter what, it made me completely happy. And I just I have a disability in my legs, and so the way I got into choreography is that I can't do a lot of things that other people can do, and there are sort of like basic vocabulary and basic steps that you have to do in order to do the next thing or whatever. And technically I always wanted to be a professional dancer, but because of my legs, I couldn't. So when I found Ariel, I was like, dancing. And so I got into choreographing because I had to figure out alternatives to get from A to B, because I couldn't do A the way that it was defined. But I had to come up with like A prime in order to get to B, which typically turned out to be B prime. So like everybody else was doing this sort of sequence of movement, and I would have to completely reorient it to make it possible for me to do something that looks or similar to that. And then that just got, and it's very theoretical, right? It's very, I think choreography is the closest thing to doing philosophy, or philosophy is the closest thing to doing choreography. Let's put it like that.
I can see that. And it's very interpersonal. I mean, to come back to what we were saying at the beginning, it's a way to be together in an abstraction. It's I can see the bridge, and it's so empowering. I imagine I didn't have the pleasure to ever try Ariel, but wow, it's must be very enlivening.
It really is. It's very hard. It's like, I mean, and the funny, like I do, because I'm an aerialist, I do solo work. And so I do solo choreography. So my life as an aerialist is very much like my life as a philosopher. There's a lot of theorizing, a lot of conceptualizing, a lot of breaking down, deconstruction, and it's a lot of alone time. It's a lot of being with your own thoughts, and it's very, very hard and very, very painful. And then when you make your own thing, then you get to show it to other people, and maybe they pay attention or maybe they don't. So you're still in the same problem that you started in, is like, I made a thing, do you want to see it? And some people, they don't care.
But others, it becomes the seeds that brings beauty and meaning to the world, the same way in which it reached you. Because I mean, it wasn't that easy for you to be reached in a moment in which you had to have so many priorities in your life. Nevertheless, there was a certain book that spoke to you, or a certain show. I mean, you found your way to be. And was there any time in life in which you had to challenge everything you were? You had to question all that you were, and I don't know, had to start from scratch or something?
One of my goals is to fight stigma of mental health. So I have something called borderline personality disorder, which is very much like bipolar, or, except for that it's trauma based. And it's something that I've struggled with forever. And I really struggled with it for a really, really long time, like really, really bad. And
when were you diagnosed?
20.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
mhm.
And they kept trying to give me, at that point, they didn't know how to deal with it. So they kept trying to give me antidepressants, and I don't tolerate those. And I was sick and I would just come off of them. And so most of my life, I was never able to medicate, which is why it was so bad. And then in my late 30s, things just really got out of hand, like life-wise, stress-wise, like psychology-wise. I was overwhelmed. I was anxious. I was dealing with a lot of problems, and everything was going on. And that's not a good storm for people of my ilk. And I tried to off myself. And, I'll save you the details, but I went for a really glamorous, imaginative way. And I wanted to be so creative about it that I failed. And then I tried again, because I was like, oh, I'll just try harder. Because I didn't want like some sort of like mundane story. I wanted to be like, and then she went out like this. And so my machinations didn't work out as well as I wanted them to. And then I had to start over. Who am I? What am I going to do? How do I go forward? It's like my whole thing was like, obviously the universe doesn't want me to go. Like, I gave it my best shot. There, and then I was like, I guess I'm here for a reason. I went through that whole thing. Who am I? Why am I here? And then I was just like, I guess it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Here, right? And then I found a psychiatrist who put me on the same medication that they use for schizophrenics and bipolar people. So they put me on like seizure medicine.
Okay.
So like, I guess for borderline personality disorder, it's like your brain is having emotional seizure. I think you know this because what you do. Yeah. So like my brain was having like bipolar people have like waves, and people with borderline have like spikes all day long. Yeah. Right. So it was just constant. And then I just got to a point where it was like, it was just like lightning in my head all the time. Yeah. And then the medicine helped.
I'm glad.
Yeah. And it kind of dull, like it kind of feels like I'm wearing a heavy blanket, which, I used to live the rock star lifestyle, but that wasn't working out for me very well. And now I just live more of the, the relatively cool lifestyle. I don't know. I mean, that's sort of when I got into aerial. I luckily found aerial not too long after that. And that's always been like my anchor, which is why I've been struggling since I've been injured, because I kind of feel like I don't have an anchor right now.
Right. I hope you can come back to it soon.
Yeah, I went last night and tried to do just like some little small baby things. And it was very, like, I'm talking like first day of class.
I know.
And I went and I was like, this is so hard. And I was really embarrassed because like I have a studio that I go to and I have like all of my own equipment. Like I have like a rope and a sling and a pulley system, and it's all there, and I would go and I would train, and like all the people would like watch me, and I felt so glamorous. And then I was in there last night and I was barely doing I was crying. I was whining. I was like, I can't believe I can't do this. But it was wonderful. It felt good. It felt good to suck so bad.
And life is like that, especially for women. The circle, it seems that we have to start over and over again. And there's a moment in which, okay, everything burns and you have to start from scratch. But then it's not from scratch, because at some point you discover that all that you lost, you'll recover it later on. It's
very Phoenix-like. It's very Phoenix. I don't know. I guess I went down as a Phoenix and came up as a Robin. I mean, I think that if you ask other people who've known me forever, like all the people in philosophy, they probably can see like Shay is like this sort of like maniacal force that was, I mean, I was just a force, but it wasn't always for good. And then all of a sudden, then there's like Shay, who just kind of bobs along, you know. So I think people who've known me for a long time would probably, you know, if you ask them like, what's Shay up to, they'd probably be like, I don't know, but she seems a little different. Yeah.
But as far as I know you now in this moment, I perceive lots of energy flowing from you.
This is pretty low key. This is pretty low key, to be fair.
So yeah, I'm sorry for the feeling of the heavy blanket that you feel to carry. But certainly to me, it arrives really a burst of energy and life. That's what.
That's good. That's good
to me in this moment. Absolutely. And look, yeah, time really, as usual, run by. It's our hour is already gone. I don't know how that happened.
What a not great point to end on, though. To be fair.
No, I still have one question.
Okay, good.
So yes, my juicy question that gives the name to the podcast, and I always keep it for later. So, all in all, I mean, looking at your life, at what you wrote, at the fights that you have to fight every day, what do you think, if there's any, is the meaning of life? Yeah, I know, right? I keep it for later.
It depends on when you ask me. Most of the time, I just throw myself on the fainting couch and I say, there is no meaning of life. And then sometimes I try to be a little more reasonable.
Okay.
And I guess it really doesn't matter if there is a meaning of life. It's just that, again, I think it's different for people who experienced what I experienced, is that the meaning of life becomes less important than, well, I have life, so what am I going to do with it now?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? I feel like the loftiness of the question becomes a moot point.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So I still don't know what my purpose is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like sometimes I think it's this and sometimes I think it's that. And sometimes I want to be a good role model. And sometimes, you know, I want to be a friend and I want to help and I want to do all these other things and I want to make sure people have a good time. But, you know, I try to do meaningful things in small ways because that's all I've got.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know, I don't have a lot of reverberation power.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The circle for my actions is small, and so I try to make small contributions where I can.
A lot. I mean, your biography is impressive, Shay. I don't know how small that is because it doesn't seem so small.
Yeah, I guess I don't consider much of that stuff like related to my purpose of life. I don't know. I feel like when I can talk to people about these kinds of things and I can actually make my ideas land for regular people.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about like my friends and like, you know, when I can try to like help them, my aerial coach just got into a skydiving accident and she shattered both of her legs and her pelvis. That was last week. And she's a professional aerialist and she makes her living doing aerial and traveling circus and doing all these things. So, you know, I've spent time with her in the hospital talking about, well, now that you're stuck here, since you made it through, lucky you, like, okay, so now what do you think? And now what are you going to do? And I try to talk to her about being, having disabilities, and like how because like she helped me make the adaptations. And I'm like, Connie, think about it. Think of all the things that you helped me learn how to do, because I can't do what you did. Right. Like, now we just do that for you. And so sort of the despair that she was feeling kind of like lifted a little bit. And then I'm like, I did it good. Those are the kinds of things when I think about like, what's my purpose of life? I think it's just to kind of help other people feel better when they're in shitty situations.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, happiness in this might be one byproduct. One of the many outcomes, but it's not required. I mean, it's as far as I understand, being able to lend your ideas, help people to feel better with what you have is meaningful per se.
And that can bring its own happiness. It's just a different kind of I mean, it's not the kind of happiness that you get from a cupcake, which is sort of max happiness. That's peak happiness, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like a little baby happiness. It's fine. Sorry, I really have a thing for cake.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Sorry.
Especially for me now, I always think about food. Thank you so much, Shay, for this wonderful interview, for the time you dedicated to us today. It was really lovely to get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, no problem.